Michael Podhorzer. Welcome to Freedom Over Fascism.
Hi, it's great to be here, Stephanie.
Thank you for joining us.
Sure.
I have so many questions swirling in my head. You and I just discussed a few of them. But let's start, in some ways, at the end. Over the last couple of weeks, months, it's hard to tell, time has sort of collapsed on itself. A lot of things have changed in both the presidential campaign, perhaps in the twilight struggle against fascism, as you noted. Can you tell us where we are in terms of, first, the campaigns, plural, because it's not just the presidential, and then maybe we can talk about, the more in-depth questions about, fascism and how to understand this moment in our
Sure.
history.
Sure. The risk of triggering some bad memories. If you remember, after Trump lost the popular vote but won the Electoral College in 2016, uh, probably everybody listening to this was feeling a sense of dread about the future. We were told as he flipped three reliable Democratic states that were chock full of these white non-college voters, that Democrats really didn't have a path, right? Since then, in those five states, Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, there have been 27 statewide elections. That's for president, for the Senate, and for governor. They've lost 23 of them, right? Sit with that, right? We've gone through now, an astonishing 8 years of history, whether it's the worst pandemic in a century, the only insurrection in American history, two impeachment trials, and we are in exactly the same place, which is that there is a solid majority of Americans who do not want Donald Trump to be president. There was never anything close to a majority that wanted that. And there is certainly not a majority that wants the policies that he's enunciated or what's in Project 2025. What determined every one of those elections and what will determine what happens in whatever 63 or 62 days is whether or not that anti-MAGA majority again comes out to vote. That's our work, right? There's a way in which reading the headlines every day, clicking on 538 to see the latest projection for the election, gives us less idea of the world we live in than just realizing that, like you and me, we don't want that future. And that is what most people in America don't want either, right? And so, as you know, reading what I've written, what I've been speaking, I've been really boring and monotonous about that, right? As each as each day, like there's a new thing. Oh my
Not
God.
that you're boring, but but it hasn't changed.
But it's like there's all this noise out there that people like scamper over to say now, like young people of color are suddenly wanting Republicans or this or that. And it's all a distraction, right? What we knew in 2016 after the election, that American politics, unfortunately, is going to hinge on the outcome of elections in those three states I mentioned, plus Arizona and Georgia, and now Nevada, right? That's the pivot point for where we're going to go. And we also know, unfortunately, that in all those elections, often the win is by, like in Wisconsin, 20,000 votes for Trump in 2016, 20,000 votes for Biden in 2020, right? Throw away your idea of whether the latest poll is within the margin of error, and remember that every one of these elections is within the margin of our effort, right? And like there are more people in all these elections, in all these states, that have voted against them than have voted for them. We just have to make sure that they know again that their vote is needed to prevent that dystopian future.
So, in that quest, okay, so the audience here is activists mostly, and we talk a lot about ignoring the polls. We also talk a lot about messaging, and primarily the messaging that comes out of your briefings, and Anat is
Thank you.
our, goddess of messaging. Um, and so, and we've been seeing that finally the the freedom framing has made its way up the ticket, and finally the messaging is what you guys have been talking about for years. How do you think it's going in terms of, this is the wishy-washy stuff. There's the excitement. Are people going to come out? I don't think that there's such a thing as an undecided voter. I think there's people who are going to decide to vote or not. Maybe there's some Republicans that need a permission structure and will vote. Um, but how does it feel right now in terms of um, college students and new registrations and all the things that we need for this to come out on our side, even before we protect the vote? Um, where does that stand in your estimation right now?
Yeah, so here's where I think. I think that a way to, if I can take a step back and sort of narrate this,
Mm-hmm.
what seems, as you brought up at the beginning, of time collapsing on itself, right? And if you think about the day before Biden stepped aside, right, as a sort of beginning of this story, right? At that point, even as everyone was panicking because they were reading that Trump's lead was getting larger, no one was noticing that the percentage of the vote for him had not increased at all since where it was in 2020. What was happening was that more and more people who had voted against him, or if they were new, would vote against him, were parking themselves in third party or undecided when they got asked by a pollster, right? They hadn't switched to Trump, right? Only maybe 4% of people who had voted for Biden in 2020 were saying they were actually going to vote for Trump, right? For the most part, the 20% of Biden voters had just parked themselves somewhere else, right? These are young people, people of color, all the people that we were told had just suddenly decided to realign to the Republican Party, right?
Right.
But they were just sad about their choice, right? And
The double haters.
the day after, 81-year-old Biden stepped aside, in a very patriotic, important way, though that they just started rushing back, right? Because even without knowing much about Harris, they were just so frustrated. Let me give you a little bit of the reasoning for why that dynamic worked that way, which is that the really big majority of those 20% who just weren't willing to say they were voting for Biden were millennials and Gen Z. And for them, and it can be hard if you are not in that generation or not really clued in with your kids or really looking at it, their experience of entering the labor market is so different from what it was for everyone who entered before, right? For the most part, their hopes haven't materialized. Everything has been restructured to be more precarious. And we see it in all the polls that show almost no confidence in those generations in our institutions and a desire to overturn everything. And so there's a candidate who wants to overturn and everything Donald Trump. And a lot of simple minded people thought, oh my God, all these people will want to go there. But they were rational enough to know that the overturning they wanted wasn't to lose the right to an abortion. It wasn't to lose their pre existing conditions. It wasn't to see their friends deported, right? And so they turned to who they had to vote for, who's going to slay that fascist dragon, and it was Joe Biden,
Oh, slay.
right? And he was saying that he was going to slay that dragon on behalf of this beautiful status quo we all want to protect, right? So if you're in the
Right.
mindset I described, it's like, oh my God, what kind of choice is this, right? And so when you take a poll, you're just not going to want to like be a whole plus one and enthusiastic for the guy who's promising to do what you want and protect the system you hate, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when that was removed, and if you listen to how Harris has talked about it, she's reassuring on all of that, right? She's a different generation. It's a different thing. And so right off the bat, like those voters start telling pollsters, yeah, we're actually on board with this. We were always against Trump and MAGA, and that's where we are. Now, where this creates something of a risk for the next 2 months is that I don't know if you were at the Democratic convention. I was, and people were just exuberant as complete, like everybody felt like they had just gotten a stay of execution, right? And we're just really pumped. That is great and necessary for us to win, but don't take for granted that everyone else feels that way.
Right.
Right. And because what activates the anti MAGA majority is not just messaging, but the belief that if Trump is elected, he will do a national abortion ban, et cetera. Right. And Harris, in her acceptance speech, really captured that there are two parts to what has to happen. The first was finally someone who was willing to say that Trump is an unserious person, right? To bait like what Walz did by calling them weird, right? It is always an essential element in fighting wannabe dictators at the polls to be clear that you think they're clowns and bullies, right? And unfortunately, the sort of Biden paradigm was that they themselves were deep and powerful threats, right? The second
Right.
part, though, is that even if they are clowns and unserious people, if they're elected, if we give them power, the consequences will be very, very serious, right? And we can't lose that part, right? We can't lose the part of convincing our friends, the people we talk to, and so on, that it isn't that we don't have to worry about them because they're clowns, but that we have to understand that if they win, all those things will happen. But the only way they can win is if we don't stand up and do our work now.
So we've got this exuberance within the Democratic Party. We've got um, uh, two generations who are skeptical. We have an unmoving MAGA constituency that will believe in him no matter what. He's not gaining new voters. He's also not losing very many. Um, and you talked about the margin of effort, and we talk a lot about here is what we can do to make sure that we're doing our part. And I um, I ask people to take the messaging around freedom and then just go talk to everyone they know. Um, can you explain what you mean by the margin of effort and what how you see that playing out?
Sure. So um, let me introduce a way of thinking about how elections work that isn't really the way the media reports it. Um, there are a substantial number of people in this country, maybe as many as 90 million or so, who vote in every election no matter what, because it's the first Tuesday in November, right? And that group is more conservative, more Republican, whatever label you want to put on it, than the rest of the country. Okay. There are about another 100 million people almost who have voted at least once over the last couple of elections or have ever voted or just coming into the electorate, right? They, for the most part, are not habitual voters because they're not really thrilled with the political system. They don't really think there's much efficacy in voting. That's why they're not habitual voters, right? For them,
Hmm.
what gets them to the polls is first what's called loss aversion, right? It's not about making a decision in this sort of side by side comparison on issues of who, like you think, will be a better president. It's if there's one or maybe a few things that you think will be worse in your life if they get elected, right? After that, it's whether any of the many identities we all carry around with really get triggered. And then after that, a very small number of people actually looking at policies and stuff like that. But what gets people that we need to win to go vote is not just, say, agreeing with Harris or disagreeing with Trump. It's actually believing that if Trump wins, they'll lose the right to an abortion or they will lose any of these other freedoms, right? It's not just knowing what Trump wants or what his position is, but actually believing that you personally will lose something if he's elected. And that's what gets people to vote, right? And polling masks that because polling is just making a decision between a couple options on your computer screen or talking to a pollster, right, on the phone, right? It's like the difference between if you're still a smoker and someone a pollster asks you, "Are you going to quit smoking?" And a lot more people are going to say yes than actually do, right? Even though they wanted to, because like quitting is a behavior, wanting to quit is an opinion. Being for Harris or Trump is an opinion, deciding to actually go out and vote is a behavior. And behavior is almost always triggered at a more visceral level than it is people making a rational choice. Well, let's see, is it really worth the mileage or whatever, right? That's not what it is. And I hate to use a football metaphor, but it's not really. But it's like at the beginning of this year, like the 49ers and the Chiefs did not have the most fans of any Super Bowl matchup ever. But the viewership for this Super Bowl was higher than any in history. Why? Duh, Taylor Swift. Because it became buzzy, because people were like, oh, there's a thing. Oh, there's a Super Bowl party. Oh, whatever. I have no idea what a line of scrimmage is, but I'm going to get up and do a behavior, which is go to my friend's house to watch this game, right? That's what we have to do now, right? Is is that social dimension that triggers people actually doing the thing rather than expressing an opinion about it on a poll.
So if I understand correctly, one of your beliefs is that they have to think that the way they're going to vote is actually going to change their lives.
Right. That it's going, but more precisely that voting is a veto on a future they don't want, right? that which is different
Hmm.
from just a more generic, oh, it can, like, it'll affect me, right? That the
Right.
group of voters we're talking about, for very, very good reason, are enormously skeptical that any politician will make their life better, right? But they're
Right.
convinced that politicians can make their lives worse because that's their entire adult life, right?
Right.
So, right. And so that's credible, right? Saying, this or that positive definitely matters to the people who are going to vote in November, regardless of what's on the ballot, right? But it's another way of thinking about what the election's like for this group of contingent voters is it's more like a ballot initiative than a candidate choice, right? If you make it into the national referendum on an abortion ban or fill in the blank, then it's the path to the polls is clear, right? And one of the things that was so important about Harris, not Biden, is so many of us now feel less cringy telling people to vote, right? That we're now like
Hmm.
ready to go out and say, have you voted yet? Have you voted yet? Right. And all of that, because you know that you're not going to get all these eye rolls, that people aren't going to say, oh, God, here are the things I don't like about Biden and all of that. And that
Hmm.
sort of creates that Taylor Swift energy.
So, how do you get folks who live in either battlegrounds or, as we say, power building red states, to believe that anything they do will make a difference, given that in the red states there's the statewide supermajorities in the state houses, and in battleground states it's kind of on the edge. Is that a a, a bigger motivator? Obviously, it's a bigger motivator in the battleground states, and we see voting numbers, the differential, to be big on whether
Right.
um, people think that they can make a difference. So, how do we reach the millennials and Gen Zs and the people who have been double haters and disaffected and but really want to protect abortion, uh, to think that their vote actually can make a difference?
Yeah. So I mean, you're asking the hardest part, right, in a way, which is with 60 days, what can you do in a red state that is going to matter? And there are a few specific things that will for sure matter that people should pay attention to. And then I want to make a larger point. If you are in a red state, but live in a congressional district or in a state legislative district that is not already clearly blue or red, it is really important to run up the margin for our side in those places. Because remember that on January 3rd, the new House of Representatives reconstitutes itself. And we look at how close the margins are now. It won't, I think, if Harris wins, the odds are that there'll be on paper, like theoretically, a Democratic majority in the House too, but awfully close, right? And so if you think about then 3 days later, the next January 6th, and the potential of a vote on accepting the electors, that competitive congressional district in your state is about that, right? And we saw in 2022 in the midterms how even in blue states, Republicans picked up seats because voters didn't realize it was also an election on whether to elect Kevin McCarthy or Mike Johnson as Speaker of the House, right? So right off the bat, it's important, like the immediate thing. We have to win every House seat in those states if we want to be in the best position to defend a victory. Okay. After that, the same kind of with state legislatures, because remember how much mischief they've tried to create after the election before, right? There were all those ridiculous but intentionally conceived to undermine the results of the election, quote, audits in those states, right? Get more Democratic state legislatures. Not going to tip the body overnight, but it matters, right? And so that's like, give me 2 months in red states. It's about the best I can do. But
You need
beyond,
10 years for that.
not even. I think it's really important to recognize what Stacey Abrams and all the people around her managed to accomplish over several cycles, right? There's no one cycle solution to being that far behind, right? Look at the way in which the courageous campaigns really, that were run to get rid of Joe Arpaio in Arizona paid
Mhm.
off after a few cycles there, right? So,
Well, and yeah, you have to get people to run in the uncontested seats. And we talk about this all the time on this podcast, is that you got to run in the uncontested seats because, um, there's a lot of votes you're just missing out on. And the top of the
right,
ticket can really use those
right,
votes in particular states. And last week we also talked to David Callahan, who's telling people where to put their money. And he talked about two particular uh, movements in California and New York to remind people that there are seats there that are really important to flip the balance of power.
absolutely.
So, people in blue states don't necessarily have to, they have to do stuff too.
Sure.
And having spent the first half of my life in California and the second half of my life in Massachusetts, I understand how easy it is to get complacent, right?
Right.
Hey, I'm in Massachusetts. I'm never going to leave, or if I do, I'm going to go to another blue state. I'll be fine.
Right.
But yeah, I've done work in Indiana, and they're not fine. They're
No.
nowhere close to fine. Um, so, all right, so we do what we can in the red states, and we try to run up the margins in the parts of the battleground states where we know we can win, and we pick up House seats, and we really hope to God that John Tester can pull it out in Montana.
Right.
Uh, what other pieces of knowledge is it important for? I mean, so I've been reading your stuff, and the first thing that really grabbed me was a couple years ago when you said we have this faction in American historical history and politics that has been oligarchical and white supremacists since the very beginning, and that's who these people are now. And then, you talked also about how the biggest differentiator, whether people will vote for Trump, is, I'm telling you all the things that you said, right? I'm just,
Yeah.
isn't college education, it's racial resentment. And then you just talked about labor unions this week. So how do we sort all of that out? Or does it really just not matter? And we really have to focus on the sliver of people who we can get out to vote in places where it matters in 62 days.
Well, in 62 days, that's absolutely what matters, right? There's no grand solution to the problems we haven't solved for 250 years to recommend for people that, hadn't thought of that. We can do it right away, right?
Yeah, let's change the electoral college before November.
Well, that's not happening. But, to go back to loss aversion, that is the reason we're always in the most important election of our lifetime, because losing means not being able or being much harder to make progress, right? It's a precondition to progress. It's not progress itself, right? And as someone who, like California and Massachusetts, right, you are in on a really big secret about America, which is that in half the country since Barack Obama was elected, things have gotten much, much better for people. The right to an abortion is more solidly protected until the Supreme Court showed up. The regulation of AR-15s and firearms, you were safer. The the while like the big story about America is voter suppression and all the fascist things, blue America is like 150 million people where we've just seen enormous strides towards multiracial democracy, right? It is easier to vote in all of these places, right? We have to just accept that our constitutional and federalist structure means that it is a pretty high bar, an enormous amount of power for us to be able to make that the law of the entire land, right? But if we let them into power, all that progress we've been able to make is in jeopardy, right? And over time, like the number of states and the number of people living in those states who become more blue will increase, right? But this is a problem that our founders bequeathed to us, right? And it's one that our commentators and our polling keeps blinding us to, right? Which is that we are not one national polity, we're not one demos, right? We are not, as individual voters, sovereign in questions of what the nation's going to do. The 50 states are. And control of those states in red states can be easily hacked by theocrats and the extractive industries and so on, right? And that's why we're at loggerheads.
Yeah, and to say it even more specifically, when the founders created this country, they needed to find a way for the, I guess, in some ways, it's the extractive industries, the enslavers,
Right.
to be a part of it, so to be strong enough to survive. Yet we're reaping the the
Right.
rewards of it 250 years later, um, because our structures and our institutions are still stuck
Right.
250 years
I
ago.
mean, I know it's like pretty hard to believe that in 1789 they couldn't just develop the perfect system of government for us living in the 21st century. That
Right, when there had been no democracy anywhere
right,
anyway.
right. It's right, but we're sort of that like founding story really kind of slips up, right? Is that even though the first words of the Constitution are "We the people," it was really "We the states," and the way to think about it is more like a mutual defense treaty. And as you were observing, there were a lot of threats. I mean, there was not a nuclear power back then, right? We were not that. We were threatened by England, by Spain, by the French, by the Native Americans, like that we were like beginning the genocide of, right? And they were looking for a way to be united against all those threats. And in that context, the states that were not engaged in slavery felt that, on balance, that was a better thing. But it's really better to think of the Constitution, right, as the document that made sure, the pact that made sure that America didn't become the country that was imagined by the opening rhetoric of the Declaration of Independence, right? And right,
Right,
it was protection against becoming that country.
right, and it's all encoded anyway, right? The Declaration of Independence, all men being equal, is white Christian men with property. Um, and I think it's hard for people to kind of. So, I'm a historian. Here's my theory on how Americans view history. and tell me if you think I'm just completely off my rocker.
Got it. Yeah.
It's because I am occasionally, is that we're so young that we are perpetually thinking that where we are is where we're going to end up, that this time um, continuum of history that goes back many thousands of years and will continue is actually we're at the end of it, right? And so where we are now is where we're always going to be, and therefore there's no changing it. But also that we're at the apogee of anything ever, and that's simply not true. I mean, there have been periods of history where countries have done better and then have really fallen behind. People, massive pandemics, wars, guns, germs, and steel, right? So my theory is that it's really hard for Americans to understand what we're doing now is part of a much larger continuum rather than the end game.
Right. I
That's my
think
theory.
I think I mostly agree, but I could try to restate it a little bit differently.
Oh, good, because maybe I
Right.
can not sound so crazy.
And also extend like I don't this is a human phenomenon, not an American
No,
phenomenon.
yeah, yeah.
Um it's that the you're so this is a podcast where maybe some people will be familiar with this term, but there's a term called hegemonic common sense. And the idea of it is that there are certain things that everyone in the society believes that don't make any sense because it advances the interests of those in power. And it is very difficult to think outside that box, right? And so it's disputed who actually said it first, but there's a gray line that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, right? That,
Okay, yeah.
right? And that's, I think, the phenomenon you're talking about, right? Is that it is really hard to imagine a different future for almost all people at all times and places. And then periodically, in a big way, that gets shaken up and there's a new common sense that everybody accepts, right? And sometimes it's much more progressive, right? And sometimes it's much worse. So, like, be it being old enough to have lived in the world before neoliberalism, right? When I was growing up, the equally sticky idea of how things work for America was pluralism, that you had
Hmm.
labor, you had business, and you had government. And like people really didn't pay attention with these microscopes to polls and like believing that like what voters thought one by one is what we should add up, right? It was like there were different segments of society that were vying for power and we understood how to do it. And then suddenly it wasn't, right? And suddenly the
Hmm.
only way you could think about things is kind of in all contexts, a kind of market rationalism, right? That we're all atomistic. We don't think about social relationships. Everything is aggregated preferences. And you can't get yourself from here to a better world if your mind's stuck there, right? And I think that's a lot of what you were trying to get at, maybe, that that it's especially if you like aren't lucky or unlucky to have your life straddle two of these, it's
Hmm.
really like hard to imagine a different world, right?
Right. It's kind of
And
event horizon, and we haven't, most of, even you haven't lived through the
right,
cataclysms, um, I think about somebody who was my great grandmother, say, born in
right,
1889, right? You had uh, the war, the flu, the
right, exactly,
war, like it had several different completely world altering
right,
things where we've been pretty steady for a long time.
absolutely, and
Not on an individual level. There's a
yeah,
long way to go, but
and
yeah.
that's right. But it also, but the where think you were going was like, but history tells us there's good reason to hope and fear, right?
Mhm.
That those moments do come, and when they come, right, everything's kind of reshuffled, right? If you
Right.
think
We're finally seeing that with the pandemic, right?
remember that less than a century ago, in the Depression and the 1930s, before say 1934 or 5, right? Like, we didn't have unions like we have now. In fact, if you tried to organize, in most places, they'd send National Guard or Pinkerton and get away with shooting you, right?
Mhm.
And inequality, all the things like that were like actually worse functionally than they are now, because not only were like the ratios kind of like what they are now, but you were talking about squalor then, right?
Right.
And and so there was one of these, rips in time because of the Depression. And we people rushed in, we sat down in, auto plants, we did all these things and changed the balance of power, right? We got more power. And that's how history moves. It's kind of nothing happens, nothing happens, nothing happens, nothing happens, and then a big thing
And boom.
happens, and it
Mhm.
goes, in one direction or the other.
Right. So, uh, and I think just one last thing about this is I said the pandemic. So the depression, all the things that you say are true, and yet the way out, the New Deal, also really only focused on white people, right? So the Black community wasn't a beneficiary. The GI Bill didn't apply, so there were still levels. And
Right.
I'm thinking right now
Absolutely.
about the pandemic. I have a 16-year-old. His life, the way he lives it, I think was very changed by the fact that for 2 years he didn't see anyone.
Right.
And there's the Gen Z, we don't know what's going to
Sure.
get them to, we don't know how they're going to adhere or disadhere and so I think that's actually really exciting to watch.
Yeah, for sure.
Um, so back to our moment, let's wrap up by just telling people where they can find more of you and the briefings and making sure they're keeping up with what's really going on and not the stupid crap in the corporate media, which we also talk about a lot, but where they can find really great information and analysis and messaging and instructions.
Sure. The main thing of this is I publish a Substack, Weekend Reading, which hopefully can put in the notes. And Anat Schenker, who
I
you
will
mentioned
absolutely do that,
earlier, has several places you can go for great, constantly updated messaging. Probably the most relevant is,
including here, like a year more than a year ago. Yeah.
yeah, Freedom Over Fascism. And that's where I'd start.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for coming
Oh,
on.
of
I
course.
wanted
Thank
to
you
talk
for
to you
this.
for a really long time.
Oh, thank you. That means a lot.
Um, and so, yeah, I guess we got to win in November, but it's necessary, but not sufficient. And
Absolutely. Right.
just we keep
And that
going.
we have to, not to be both upbeat and not, right? We have to avoid what I called right after the 2020 election, the great forgetting. And by great
Right.
forgetting, what I mean is that during the Trump years, suddenly it was like a light came on and everybody realized all the serious problems in this country and all of sort of who they were and what they were about. And then as soon as the election was over, almost everyone wanted to think none of the things they thought a minute ago really mattered and they could go about their normal business, right? And we keep making that mistake when we win, right? Is that right? The problem we can only somehow see,
Done it.
right? We can only see these crises. We can only care about George Floyd. We can only understand what's systemically wrong here when we're not in power, right? And then when we are, we just move on, right? And we can't make that mistake again when we win this time.
There we go. Thank you so
Okay.
much. I'm
Thank
going to stop
you.
the recording now.